Hello and welcome to Speed Politics 101, your go-to channel for unpacking the world of politics, society, and everything in between. I'm Billy Agwanda, and I'm thrilled to have you here as we explore the fascinating ideas that shape our societies, past, present, and future. If you're curious about how politics influences our everyday lives, hit the subscribe and notification button so you never miss an update. In the realm of political philosophy, John Locke is considered the next significant Western political thinker after Thomas Hobbes. In his philosophy, Locke is often seen as responding to and building upon Hobbes's ideas, particularly in his work The Two Treatises of Government. But to understand Locke's philosophy, we need to go to the very beginning and examine the political context that inspired Locke's political thought. Imagine it's late 17th century in England and the country is in turmoil. There is religious persecution, political unrest, and a king, James II, who believes he rules by divine right, above the law and the people. But then, something remarkable happens. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 sweeps King James off the throne, and a new era of constitutional monarchy begins. It was during this moment of upheaval that John Locke emerged with ideas that, as we have all come to know it, would reshape the foundations of political thought to this day. But why did Locke write his Two Treatises of Government? Surely, he wasn't just sitting around thinking abstractly about human nature and government. Rather, what we can see is that Locke was responding to the chaos of his time. He was answering the big question: what should government look like in a world where absolute monarchy has failed? From Locke's point of view, England was transitioning from an era of absolute rule to a constitutional monarchy. Religious wars and persecution had torn communities apart, and Locke knew that stability couldn't come from force or fear. It had to come from consent, from trust, and from justice. So, as we begin to engage with Locke, we should remember that he was not just writing for philosophers. He was writing for a world on the edge of transformation. As we will come to see later on, his ideas would inspire revolutions in America and France and shape the very idea of liberal democracy. He showed us that power doesn't come from divine authority; instead, that political power comes from the people. Let us now embark on exploring the building blocks of Locke's philosophy, beginning with his views on natural law. Imagine a world where certain moral truths apply to everyone, no matter where you live or what society you are part of. This is the idea behind John Locke's theory of natural law and natural rights, a cornerstone of his political philosophy. But Locke didn't invent these ideas. The concept of natural law had existed for centuries as a way to distinguish universal truths, those that are by nature, from laws that are merely conventional, applying only where specific agreements or traditions have been established. Think of it as the difference between universal principles and local rules. What John Locke did was to take this ancient idea and give it a new dimension. He argued that natural law, unlike divine law, does not require a prophet or a sacred text to uncover. It can be discovered through reason alone, and applies to all people. Divine law, by contrast, comes through special revelation, like the Ten Commandments, which clearly addresses a specific group like Israelites in the Old Testament of the Bible or Christians today. Locke thought divine and natural law could overlap, but they weren't the same. If the Bible seemed to contradict natural law, Locke would say that we have probably misinterpreted the scripture, because for him, reason was the ultimate guide to understanding moral truths. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Alongside natural law, Locke also focused on natural rights, a concept championed by other thinkers like Grotius, Hobbes, and Pufendorf. Where natural law emphasizes our duties, natural rights emphasize our claims, the privileges and entitlements every individual enjoys simply by virtue of being human. For Locke, these rights, especially the right to preserve one's life, were central to his philosophy. But not everyone agrees on how Locke balanced natural law and natural rights. Some scholars, like Leo Strauss, argue that Locke leaned heavily on rights, portraying humans as fundamentally self-interested. According to this view, we see an important philosophical alignment between Locke and Hobbes. This is because it is becoming more apparent that Locke believed that natural law obligations only mattered when they didn't conflict with self-preservation, making self-interest a key argument of Hobbes, the driving force of human behavior. But this is the beauty of Locke's philosophy: it is open to interpretation. Was he a champion of universal duties, or was he focused on individual rights? Did he believe humans were motivated by reason or self-interest? Previously, we have encountered Locke's argument that governments derive their legitimacy not from divine right or brute force, but from the consent of the governed. This idea is central to Locke's political philosophy, and it starts with his vision of a state of nature, a world where people are free and independent but lack a common authority to resolve disputes. According to Locke, it's our consent that allows us to leave the state of nature and form political societies. Sure, there are natural laws that bind us all, but the real obligations, the ones that make us part of a political community, come only when we voluntarily agree to them. But here's the challenge: how many of us have actually signed a contract with our government? If consent is required, does that mean most governments are illegitimate? Locke anticipated this objection, and his solution was the concept of tacit consent. It's simple, he argued: by walking on the streets of a country, living within its borders, or inheriting property, you tacitly agree to obey its laws. But critics have a problem with this. Is walking on a road really consent? Is staying in your home a deliberate voluntary act of allegiance? Some of us would consider that Locke's idea of tacit consent forces people into political obligations they never truly agreed to, leading us to the unsettling conclusion that most people don't actually owe their governments obedience. Now, let us take a different angle. What if we are overstating, as a result of our own interpretations, Locke's reliance on consent? What if it is not so much about whether we have consented, but whether the government aligns with natural law? If a government protects life, liberty, and property, if it serves the public good, it's legitimate, regardless of whether anyone explicitly agreed to it. But this interpretation raises another question. What happens when a government fails to meet these standards? Locke's answer is clear: when a government becomes tyrannical, our obligation to obey dissolves. Yet again, what if we decide to embrace a much broader understanding of Locke's idea of consent? What if for Locke, it wasn't about signing a contract or even making a conscious decision? Consent could simply mean not objecting. If you are not unwilling to object, that is enough consent. But does this view stretch the idea of consent too far? Fast forward to modern scholarship. Some scholars argue that political consent comes from more practical acts, like registering to vote, while others claim that governments gain legitimacy simply by being accountable to the people. And what about the limits of consent? Locke believed that when we join a society, we agree to defend it, even at great personal risk. For example, he justifies the punishment of soldiers who desert dangerous missions, seeing their duty as part of the social contract they entered into when they became citizens. But here's the big takeaway: Locke's theory of consent isn't just about how governments are formed, it's about what governments can and should do. Is their purpose simply to protect individual rights, or do they have a broader mandate to promote the common good? Locke believed governments could do both, as long as their actions ultimately preserve society. So, why does any of this matter today? Well, one way to think about it is that Locke's ideas on consent, legitimacy, and obligation still shape how we think about government and our role within it. Are we truly free if we never explicitly agreed to the rules that govern us? Or is it enough that our governments align with universal principles of justice and the public good? These questions aren't just philosophical, they're personal, practical, and political. And they remind us that, in Locke's world, the legitimacy of power is always tied to the people it governs. Having considered the question of consent and political obligation as core pillars in the social contract, Locke turns his attention to the notion of separation of powers. Locke believed that a legitimate government must divide its functions to prevent tyranny and ensure justice. Such division of power must take into account, first and foremost, the legislative power, which Locke described as supreme because it determines how the resources of the Commonwealth are used. It creates laws that are rooted in natural law and assigns punishments for breaking them. Then there's the executive power, responsible for enforcing those laws in specific cases. But here, there is a minor twist. Locke also introduces the federative power, which deals with international relations, as nations are still in a state of nature with each other. You can think of it as the executive's role in the formulation of foreign policy. But here is an interesting question. Why doesn't Locke mention the judicial power as a separate entity? To understand this, we need to think about functions versus institutions. Locke was not so concerned about institutions like courts. He focused on functions like making laws and enforcing them. For him, interpreting the law was not a separate function. It was embedded within both the legislative and executive powers. The legislature interprets natural law to make rules, and the executive interprets those rules when applying them to specific cases. In Locke's world, these functions often overlap. For example, in 17th century England, the legislative power was not just one institution. It was shared among the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the King, showing that a single entity can perform multiple roles in government. Fast forward, and you might wonder, how does Locke's idea of separating powers compare to Montesquieu's famous trio of legislative, executive, and judicial powers? It is in my view that when we look closer, we can't see much difference. Montesquieu's judicial power overlaps with Locke's concept of executing the law domestically, and his executive power includes international affairs, much like Locke's federative power. It's really the terminology that changed, not the concepts. Locke simply saw actions like arresting, trying, and punishing as part of enforcing the law, not as a separate judicial function. But here's the part that Locke really cared about: the people. Locke believed that the legislative power should include representatives of the people, but he didn't think constitutions needed to be purely democratic. He supported mixed constitutions that included monarchs, aristocrats, and elected officials. His main concern was that the people's representatives have enough power to protect liberty and block unjust taxation. Most importantly, Locke argued that power ultimately belongs to the people. If a government becomes corrupt, if it suppresses representative assemblies, alters elections without consent, or hands the nation over to a foreign power, the people have the right to reclaim their authority, even to rebel if their rights are under threat. Now, this brings us to one of Locke's most fascinating ideas: the prerogative power. Locke argued that this is the executive's ability to act outside or even against the law for the public good. Imagine a king ordering houses to be demolished to stop a fire from spreading. That's prerogative power, a necessary flexibility when laws can't cover every situation. But what happens if the executive abuses this power? Locke foresaw this dilemma and acknowledged that, in some cases, conflict between the legislature and the executive might reach a stalemate. When that happens, Locke said, there's no judge on earth to resolve it. The only option left is what he called an appeal to heaven. Now, let us briefly talk about this appeal to heaven. For Locke, when governments fail to fulfill their obligations, and no higher authority exists to settle the matter, people have the right to take up arms and let God judge who is in the right. It's a dramatic notion, but it underscores Locke's belief in the seriousness of political power and the responsibility of governments to serve the people. Locke's ideas on separation of powers, representative government, and even the right to rebellion weren't just theories, they were revolutionary. They laid the groundwork for modern democracy, constitutional governance, and the idea that power is not absolute but conditional on serving the public good. And even today, Locke's vision challenges us to think critically about the balance of power and the rights of the people. So, I'll leave you with this. How well are we living up to Locke's ideal of a government that is accountable, just, and always answerable to the people?